Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
Today we have Bethany Burum here with us to discuss Oren Cass's working hypothesis. In 2018, Cass wrote a book called The Once and Future Worker, in which he argues for creating labor market conditions that give everyone the opportunity to contribute to society as productive workers. This position is based on an assumption that he calls the working hypothesis. This is the working hypothesis. A labor market in which workers can support strong families and communities is the central determinant of long-term prosperity and should be the central focus of public policy. So we read an Oren Cass article from the American Interest for tonight entitled The Working Hypothesis. It's adapted from his book, and throughout both the book and the article, he frequently says things like, if the working hypothesis is correct, then we ought to do X. But is the working hypothesis correct? We'll be getting into that tonight. One thing I really like about Cass's perspective is that he recognizes the power of markets and talks about creating conditions that allow markets to support our desired social outcomes. The question is, what social outcomes does it make sense for us to desire? And is giving everyone an opportunity to contribute to society through paid work one of them? And why? I also like his emphasis on the fact that economic growth alone isn't going to improve social outcomes optimally or lead to maximum prosperity. Furthermore, he rightly calls out the strategy of trying to push everyone through college so they can get a high-paying, high-status job as futile. But is vocational training really the answer? That's kind of what he suggests. So there are a lot of questions here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bethany. Go ahead, Bethany.
Hi, thanks for having me on, Alex. I really appreciate it. So just to start out, my knowledge of Oren's work is mostly limited to this article that we had for today, which is taken from his book. But with that, I'm going to give a few thoughts on things that I had issues with in the article, and then a few things that I think are kind of fruitful. So one summary of how what I took about Oren's thoughts from this article is that he thinks that working for the money that we get instead of just getting it, for example, as a basic income, which he explicitly talks about, is really important. To him, in this article, at least, it's so important that it's worth sacrificing the environment to a certain degree so that we have less clean air, we get sick more. It's worth sacrificing people's time, of course, in the sense that they're spending their time on the work. And it's worth reducing access to cheap foreign labor and efficient free trade in order to make work, essentially in order to make up work for people that they otherwise wouldn't need to do. All of these things are justified because it's really important that people work for the money that they get. This is all sort of what I'm taking from the article. And I have several concerns about this. So I think he misses a few things in his analysis. So one thing that I think that he misses is that much of his analysis of social ills seems to confound lack of money with lack of paid employment. So at least in this article, we can get to quotes later on, he talks about various problems that people are having, but a lot of these things stem from lack of money. So that's kind of one thing where it's not always clear that those things would persist if you had income from another source. He also has, though, this intuition that you need to be feeling like you're contributing to have well-being, that it's not enough to have money. But I think this intuition confounds contribution with paid employment. So it's not clear that he hasn't done any work, at least in this article, to indicate that people's well-being requires paid employment rather than just contributing. And I think this is particularly problematic because he actually advocates work that really isn't contributing indirectly, because you're using these economic policies like reducing reliance on cheap foreign labor or reducing free trade or even subsidizing people's wages to encourage people to do work that isn't necessarily actually having a contribution. So there his argument has to be that like somehow the illusion of contributing through paid employment is essential to well-being. And I don't think he's done enough for me to argue or demonstrate that. Even if there is an important need to contribute, I suspect that other kinds of contributions that aren't paid employment but are real probably trump contributions that are fake through paid employment. So that's another concern that I have with his perspective. He also seems to miss something that is less surprising to me that he misses, which is that the values people currently have and the things that they currently need for their well-being are somewhat endogenous, meaning they come out of the conditions that we currently have. This is something we talked a lot about in another meetup on cultural incentives, but it's relevant here as well. Because if people right now do require some kind of paid employment to have some sort of self-esteem or to attract a marriage partner and other things that he talks about in the article, it doesn't mean that they would in a different kind of situation where they had, for example, a basic income. Because right now, paid employment is, for many people, the only means to secure material survival, let alone any other perks above material survival. So of course, we're going to internalize the idea that it's really important to have a job. And of course, our self-esteem is going to depend on it. And of course, finding a marriage partner is going to depend on it, because otherwise they're marrying someone without necessarily any economic security, right? So all of these things follow from the conditions we have now. And it's a mistake to assume that those even those values and those things from which we get self-esteem and so on are going to persist in the same way in a different economic structure where a job isn't so essential. So I think that's something really critical that Oren misses, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Before we move on, I just wanted to acknowledge something that I think is insightful about his approach. And Alex mentioned several things that I also agree with, but I wanted to highlight that he has this idea of the short term versus the long term. Which I think is useful. So he talks about how, we might have certain kinds of economic policies that say improve our productive capacity in the short term, but decrease it in the long term because people adjust in certain ways, like perhaps they stop getting an education and then we don't have as much human capital in the long term. There are these various feedback loops that he likes to highlight. And I don't necessarily agree with all of the feedback loops that he highlights, but I do think it's an interesting thing for us to think about and might apply to a world with a basic income as well. So it might be interesting to think about what kinds of impact policy will have, something like a basic income will have on longer term production and productive capacity. So for example, maybe people would need to be paid more to work over time as the effect I mentioned before happens, as they lose this sort of internalized desire to have a job and this sense that a work is really important. You might actually have to pay them more actual cash to do that work. That could be one possible change that would happen as people adapt to a basic income over time. There might be many others, but I do think that recognition of sort of long-term effects and these feedback loops could be interesting to explore. And I think that's something insightful that Oren has in his article. So I'm happy to talk about that today a little bit too. Thanks.
Thanks. That's all very interesting. I mean, you've talked a lot about in the past about endogenous versus exogenous, like source of values, and how the value in work may be internalized today because of the conditions that exist.
Yeah.
But in his article, he's sort of also, it's funny because in a way he almost makes us explicit. He says, well, if your perspective, if our values are that benefiting consumers is what matters, then all of this becomes much simpler and we just don't have to worry about anything. But because my value is work, we have to jump through all these hoops. So I guess what's your take on this article? Where does he make it most explicit, kind of like where this comes from? Because I would imagine talking to him, if you try to say, well, it's okay because the conditions will change our values, right? Someone like this author might worry about that and say, well, yes, and that's why we have to work so hard to prevent that, because we don't want people to just think of themselves as consumers, right? So like what is the crux of his argument as far as why we should value work?
It's a great question. And Oren Cass, if you're listening, please come on and debate us, because we would love to actually let you defend yourself on here. But one of the issues I had, at least with this article, and maybe Alex can speak to the book, is that it wasn't so clear where this came from. It did almost seem like a tautology at times, like you're almost alluding to with your question, that even if I said this might change, he would want you to prevent it from changing. But then he's also kind of using it as the foundation for his other arguments. He talks in vague terms a lot, like talking about having strong communities, strong families, strong, that people want to produce, that they want to contribute. He just kind of asserts these things for the most part. And so it's kind of difficult to have a sense of why he thinks where he thinks it's coming from. It just seems like he's positing it as, well, I guess two things, kind of positing it as a given, but also he looks to data that, as I mentioned before, is somewhat confounded, right? So he'll look to data about how, like, when you have unemployment, you don't have as many marriages or something like that. And so then he would use this to argue that you need to work in order to have, stable families. But of course, like, that's highly confounded with work being a stable source of income. And he doesn't, at least in this article, really address that. So I guess he has kind of like flawed, in my opinion, flawed empirical findings, and then just kind of like an assertion. Alex, does he go into this more in the book, like why this is needed for people and like, so why it's a good thing? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he does a little bit. And in the article too, I think one of the main things he brings up is that if people aren't productive on their own, if workers in a particular economy aren't self-sufficient or aren't able to contribute to that economy, then we become more dependent on imports, less kind of self-sovereign, that kind of thing. So there's certainly an issue there, and that can be true when it comes to industrial policy as well. And kind of, you want your country, maybe at an individual level, to some extent, people want people to be self-sufficient, but at the level of country, certainly you actually need some of that redundancy as well. You don't want to depend entirely on China for all of your imports, that kind of thing. So if everybody becomes dependent on the government just giving them money through basic income, for example, and everybody in your country is just buying stuff and nobody knows how to make anything, then maybe you put yourself in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you remind me, Alex, of another answer to your question, Derek, which is I think he alludes, at least in the article, to some of these feedback loops I was talking about. Like he's concerned that if people don't value productivity and working and so on, then like they kind of lose, like Alex said, the ability to be productive, and they lose skills that maybe we actually need. So maybe you sort of like overshoot in the long run, and there's like a downward spiral of productivity. But I think he also doesn't, it's a little bit confusing to me whether he takes seriously the idea that paid work could be unproductive, even though at the same time he's proposing these policies that essentially make it unproductive. It kind of seems like at the same time he assumes that it's useful by definition in a way. So I'm not sure if that's part of the issue. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if I remember correctly, very interestingly, he does sort of suggest that there is a kind of natural efficiency to markets, and the markets are going to do. He says sort of a combination of what consumers demand, and then also what something about what economics sort of demands. And he's actually suggesting it's probably worth reducing some of that in order to achieve this other goal, which is work contribution.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. I found this article very interesting because he makes explicit a lot of things that we will usually explicitly critique in other proponents of other variants of the working hypothesis. But here he's sort of very clear about it. He's very much saying that there is something fundamentally valuable about work. And I think he does seem to take it as a given in the way you sometimes see in philosophical or moral debates, where it's like, look, we're going to start with this as a benefit, as we can all agree this is a good thing. So it's very interesting in that sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I went through this article making a lot of like detailed notes I won't bore everybody with, but there were many points at which I felt that some of these confounds were happening insofar as he did try to back this up, where again, like he would talk about being on government assistance, for example, as sort of an obvious negative. And if he backed it up, he'd back it up as kind of suggesting it wasn't enough money, for example, to like pay for your family. But then he would also argue at other times that we should cut it, or like it's too high. And so like these things didn't quite add up for me logically, because if it's a money issue, you can obviously pay people more. But as you say, he clearly believes there's something important about work, kind of above and beyond anything else. And yet I can't quite figure out why, right?
Yeah, he kind of views like a pro-worker, get everyone access or opportunity to be productive contributors, jobs, that kind of thing, as kind of win-win. It's good for, maintaining our productive capacity because everybody's able to do stuff that might contribute. So even if you're maybe doing something that's a little bit redundant with what could be imported or someone else could do or something like that, you're maintaining that capacity. So that's good. But he views it as win-win because he also views it as good for the worker because of the psychology. So I think that part of it certainly you would object to. Maybe here we would say, okay, maybe there's a reasonable argument to be made that we need some redundancy, we need to maintain some capacity, but we would push back against the psychology part of that, because we would say that is just a kind of approximate effect that ultimately serves the incentive to contribute labor.
Yeah, I think that to try to give him a charitable kind of backstory, and maybe this is his backstory, he might argue that people, just evolve to want to get to be rewarded by signals that they're contributing to their community or something like that, which might be possible. That could be something that's fairly sticky in a sort of basic sense, like hard to adapt. But what I would say back to that is like, even if that basic sort of sense of getting signals back that you're contributing is somewhat difficult to change, or is sort of just there as part of our psychology, that clearly you can look across situations and see that the specific things that you need to do to get that feedback, or like the specifics, are quite malleable. And so paid employment is definitely not the only way to have a sense that you're, being valued by your community or contributing in some way. And that I've never seen him bring up. Right. I've never seen him like distinguish between contributing and paid employment. And as I pointed out in my intro, in fact, he seems to be suggesting we waste people's time on things that aren't really contributions, arguably at least, instead of letting them like do something that really is a contribution. He would never like put it that way. But if you take paid employment out of it and look at some of the policies that he's recommending, or like the wage subsidies that he's recommending to kind of get companies to employ people, it does look like he thinks that like paid labor is so important, or like that's somehow the only way that we can get this sense of contribution. So we have to kind of like finagle that, even if it's not really a contribution totally anymore. Yeah, and I suspect, I mean, Oren Cass should come on and defend himself, as I said before, but I suspect that like it's just so ingrained for so many people that paid employment is important, because we just look around and like that is the way that people get their money and have security and get prestige, that it's sort of like hard to get out of that mindset. And Oren Cass is kind of like stuck in that mindset. I could be wrong, but that's my guess.
Well, we can't get Oren on tonight, but
Oren,
what we can do is maybe go through some of the article and actually look at it in his own words, because we might not be doing the best job summarizing here.
Great point. Yeah, that's a productive point. Yeah, definitely. And I have some quotes, and so does Alex. Or I'm happy to pause and take audience questions now too.
Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, does anyone have their, hold on, let me see who has their hand.
Nobody has their hand up.
Oh, great. Then let's go to some quotes. You snooze, you lose here. 1 second. Hold on, let me just find where I have my quotes. I said that a little prematurely. Sorry, Alex. Here we go. Okay, so pick one.
So quickly, Austin has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Which is, does Oren Cass suggest a job guarantee? And the answer is no. That part of his, he has a few different proposals, but one of the big ones that would probably stand in place of the job guarantee is that he wants to pay businesses.
Alex, you're breaking up, at least on my end for a second.
Wage subsidy. Am I breaking up for everyone, or?
No,
okay,
I got you.
Oh, sorry then. Yeah.
So he wants to pay businesses a wage subsidy. So this makes it cheaper for businesses to hire workers. You only have to pay, $9 an hour for your workers, but your workers receive $12 an hour. So it's almost like an inverted payroll tax for wages at the lower end of the spectrum, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that's interesting too. Yeah, like he's different from the job guarantee and MMT people, because he's actually kind of more relies on the market. He's really seeing like people working in a very market friendly way, in a private sector way. Like that's what he wants to encourage. And I think he does have he's critical of the government coming in and making it work for people to do. And I think if you're subsidizing employment, subsidizing low cost work in the private sector, that's a sort of an efficient way to do it, because you're mobilizing market efficient forces to use this resource, to use up more of it. So he's actually very close in many ways to some of Alex's ideas. You could almost kind of call this worker monetary theory, except there's not money. It doesn't play a big role. But he is thinking in terms of like leveraging market efficiency to get this ultimate goal of more work being done accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm ready to share a quote whenever you guys want. Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen here. I think this quote that I've pulled speaks well to what we've been talking about just now. So, or right before Austin's question. So he says, yes, material living standards contribute to prosperity, but accomplishments like fulfilling traditional obligations, building strong personal relationships, succeeding at work, supporting a family, and raising children capable of doing all these things themselves are far more important to life satisfaction. What these things have in common is their productive nature, not as boost to GDP, but as ways that people invest effort on behalf of others. Our social norms recognize productive activities as essential to a functioning and prosperous society, and so we award respect, dignity, and gratitude to those who perform them. And so I'll comment on that before moving on. So here you can kind of see hopefully some of the things that I was summarizing, or this is at least where I got some of those ideas about his perspective. So he talks about material living standards as just one thing, right? And that people need these other things on top of it. But traditional obligations, I mean, right there, we know whatever traditional obligations are is quite malleable and like doesn't have to include paid work. And some of these are also kind of vague, right? Like what does that mean? Personal relationships could be built without paid work. I mean, so some of these things, it's just like not clear why he thinks you need paid employment to do that. Succeeding at work, I mean, he's just saying that, like that's sort of tautological then, okay. Supporting a family, again, this is one of the examples I said, he sort of confounds throughout the article, so far as I can see, things that just require money with things that require paid work. But he emphasizes a lot that you should earn enough at your job to support a family, and people don't now, but then he doesn't like the idea of something like a basic income to do that. Raising children. So maybe people do have a pretty sticky desire to raise children that are capable of thriving in the world that they're in. But of course, the things that they need to do to thrive are going to be different depending on different worlds too. So, that's kind of what I mean. It's like, it's not really, he hasn't in this example really justified why he feels like you need paid employment to do all of these things. And he's here saying that our social norms recognize productive activities as essential. So I think he's getting at something that I talk about here, which is that like people are tuned into what's being socially rewarded. But again, I think he's maybe missing that it wouldn't have to be the case that paid employment is what's socially rewarded if the economic structure worked differently. And in this, he also seems in this quote to be sort of assuming that because he's sort of alluding to paid employment here, assuming that paid employment is a productive activity. And in fact, he continues to say without work, the quintessential productive activity. And yet later on, like I said, he proposes economic policies that make work less productive. So that's one of those contradictions that I have some issues with. And just to continue before I move on, he says, without work, the quintessential productive activity, self-esteem declines and a sense of helplessness increases, people become depressed. Where fewer men work, fewer marriages form, unemployment also doubles the risk of divorce, and male joblessness appears the primary culprit. These outcomes likely result from the damage to both economic prospects and individual well-being associated with being out of work, which strain existing marriages and make them men less attractive as marriage partners. So here I would say that, as I often talk about, one of these might be endogenous to the other. So your economic prospects are screwed, and so your individual well-being is going to track that. And the fact that we can measure those as separable things right now doesn't mean that the well-being isn't coming from the economic prospects. Maybe in a big picture, maybe it would take some time for our sort of feelings to adjust, but I do think those things are tied together. So I like that you asked us to go sort of to the text, Derek, but I think this is a nice example of some of those things that I was trying to talk about before, and sort of how he frames things. Does that make sense? Thoughts or questions about that?
Yeah, Alex, do you have anything? I have a lot here, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is good, and I pretty much agree with everything you're saying. I think part of the problem here is that we're not really his audience. So for the most part, he doesn't feel the need to separate the problems that are caused by people not having enough money from the problems that are caused by people not having jobs. So he acknowledges that people like us exist who think of these maybe separately, and he does pay lip service to that in parts of it, but he doesn't integrate that into his whole thesis, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, but what is interesting, just like Bethany points out, that like almost everything mentioned in that first paragraph are not actually don't have anything to do with employment in the private or public sector. They don't have anything to do with working a job. And so, I mean, I think it's clear that people have very, very strong positive feelings about work as a concept. And so, I mean, I think an article like this is a very good example of why I tend not to phrase, the policies I like in terms of like, oh, it's against work, or we don't like work, or we think there's too much work, because work is a very broad concept. I mean, he's putting in raising a family, taking care of your children as work, which of course has nothing to do really with going to your day job. And that's something that's totally separate. That's, as far as the economy is concerned, that's actually consumption. You're giving your kid food and goods presumably purchased from the economy, right? And yet this is considered a form of contribution to society. But that's debatable, I guess. But yeah, it's just interesting because there seems to be, I don't know to what extent he's aware of the fact that he's mentioning all of these social positives that aren't related to what he's talking about in the rest of the article.
Yeah, I agree. He, in one place, tries to connect relationships to work by saying that people form a lot of their strong social relationships at work. But of course, that's because they spend most of their time at work, right? So if you didn't spend most of your time at work, that doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't form strong personal relationships. So yeah.
Right. And, children form a lot of relationships at school, but they're not usually getting paid to show up at school and contribute productively, right? So people will tend to, whenever large groups of people are together, you'll tend to get relationships out of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And I like your point about how some of these things are consumption, because he talks in other parts about how consumption isn't what brings well-being, but he tends to emphasize things like iPhones, where of course feeding your children is also a form of consumption. And so, maybe the examples are a little bit cherry picked to give people the right intuition that he's going for. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Richard says in the chat, in response to the comment about, in response to the idea of a wage subsidy, he says that it promotes employers paying as little as possible. So I think to some extent you could say, oh, if you pay employers to hire people, that means they can pay workers less. And that's true to some extent. It all depends on the incidence of the subsidy, how much is captured by the worker and how much is captured by the employer, because both are true. It makes it cheaper for the employers to hire workers at lower wages, but then the lower wages plus the subsidy, that might be higher than what the wage would have been before if the worker hadn't been hired, or if the worker had been hired under the old system. Just pointing that out.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like you could theoretically also have a complicated system where you paid people some money directly if they had a job, but only if they had a job. And I guess you could have like negative tax credit. Like, I guess the earned income tax credit is a little bit like this, right? Where the government actually can pay people sort of some money if they have a job, but the job doesn't pay that much money or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could essentially make the same argument about basic income too, right? Mm-hmm. That if you're paying everyone all this money, that means they can accept jobs at lower wages, and what you're doing is making it cheaper for employers to hire people. And that's true to some extent, depending on the type of job it is. The basic income might cause some people to say no to certain types of jobs, but it also might make it cheaper for them to work certain kinds of jobs because they don't need as much money, right?
Right. But I guess a feature that seems important to him that I was trying to highlight is that you don't get the money unless you have a job also, right? So he's definitely paying people to take jobs as well, to try to incentivize that.
Yes, that's very important for him.
Yeah, good. I have another quote unless anybody from the audience wants to jump in.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I will share away. So moving to sort of this question of what he has in his thinking that maybe I think is insightful. This captures a few things, this quote, but one of them is something of this feedback loop that I mentioned in my introduction. So he says, alongside stable political institutions that protect basic freedoms, family and community provide the social structures necessary to a thriving society and a growing economy. Those institutions in turn rely on a foundation of productive work through which people find purpose and satisfaction in providing for themselves and helping others. So far we're in kind of the same zone we were before. And this is another example, speaking to Derek's question, of how he just kind of like puts this idea out there and as a bit of a given. It doesn't really back it up, at least not here. The durable growth that produces long-term prosperity is the emergent property of a virtuous cycle in which people who are able to support their families and communities improve their own productivity and raise a subsequent generation able to accomplish even more. Conversely, without access to work that can support them, families struggle to remain intact or to form in the first place, and communities cannot help but dissolve. Without stable families and communities, economic opportunities vanish. So this is what when I read this, I felt like, this was his more substantive hypothesis, you might say, which is this idea that the productivity of the whole country is sort of a long game and requires people to have I would say enough prosperity. He would say paid employment to kind of keep themselves productive, productive people, right? And I think that where he's likely getting this is in the data, where poverty certainly leads to all sorts of negative effects that then lead people and their children to being less productive, and then staying in poverty and so on. But what I haven't seen here, as I pointed out before, is anything that particularly ties this virtuous cycle to paid employment versus money. But I do think that it's interesting to think about long-term effects like this, including generational effects. And it might be interesting later in the discussion or now to think about that with basic income, like what kinds of maybe unforeseen consequences could basic income have on individuals and how they invest their time and invest in themselves and their families, and what happens with their children and so on. So I do think that's kind of an interesting lens, and it's nice to take that long view.
Yeah, he uses the phrase a lot, how important it is for people to have work that can support them, right? And it's interesting because, when you're on the job, when you are working, you're never supporting yourself, really. You're supporting the company or the product or something that's being made. And, you're giving up a lot of time that you could spend doing other things for yourself, but you're now helping this endeavor. And meanwhile, later, much later in the week, you go to the grocery store and you pay money and you buy goods from other firms, right? From other products elsewhere in the economy. So like, I mean, I just think there's a whole way in which money entering the equation here makes everything seem much more interdependent in a way that he's not looking at and not considering. And he seems very much that he's made that the villain of his story. But I would like to hear him talk more about money. I would really like to hear how he thinks money is relevant in the economy, like what it's for.
Yeah, I think he doesn't draw a clear distinction between work that's sufficient to support the worker versus work that's productive or work that maintains or invests in the productive capacity of the economy. Because the second thing is something that I think we all agree we need, and we need the incentives to be such that we have all of those things. And like Bethany was bringing up, there might be concern that with a basic income, people would invest less in the things they need to invest in to keep the economy's productive capacity up to snuff, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think he also might be alluding to here and in other places to work as something that helps the individual kind of like grow and invest in their own productive capacity as well. So there's sort of all these different components that he doesn't always tease apart. And I do think that some jobs in particular can do that they can help you like gain skills that are maybe useful in other ways or useful for the economy both. But I also think it's interesting to think about how both money and time are helpful for many of the things that he talks about in this quote. So supporting my family, of course it's good to have, I need money to do that, but also presumably if I have no free time, I can't spend time enriching the lives of my children either. And work takes away from your paid employment, takes away from your time to do these things. And that's something I feel is missing. And I wonder if he has a little bit of I don't want to say he has a bias towards white collar work, because he definitely doesn't. He's definitely focused on other work. But I guess he has a vision of work where the sort of number of hours are such that he feels like they're in good balance with these other things. But nevertheless, maybe he isn't thinking about how much better it could be if people worked even less than 8 hours a day or something like that, and had even more time to spend with their kids or to invest in skills or other productive things. Whether he thinks they would actually voluntarily do that is maybe a debate that he would get into as well. But I do think that it's interesting to think about how the things that he wants to happen might happen potentially even more with money that isn't tied to spending your time in a particular way. And I feel like that's something that maybe he hasn't explored here very much. Yeah. His look at basic income is really short and not very in depth in this particular article, at least. So it just seems like he kind of throws that away. But he doesn't really explain why money untied to an activity is necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, Derek, did you want to say something?
I don't think so. I guess it makes me wonder if maybe a framing for an argument like this that you can think about it, about what basic income or what more consumption allows is the possibility of it allowing people to do more work or more flexibility in determining the kind of work that they choose to do. And I think all of the positive associations he has here with work and productive contribution are the same if you imagine someone going out and deciding to get some lumber at Home Depot and then build a porch on the side of their house or something, or build a treehouse for their kids. Like all of, volunteer at the fire department or something. Like there's all of these ways that people can contribute that don't involve being a wage labor, don't involve having a boss and clocking in. And so I just wonder why I wonder how effective that kind of framing would be against an argument like phrased as
this. It's interesting. I mean, my sense is that on the one hand, he looks at the market in such a way and the value of the market in such a way that he might say, well, like the market is really good at giving people signals about where their effort is needed. And that maybe is one of the benefits he would see in paid employment. Like, oh, like someone's going to pay me to do this. There's sort of like a signal there that it's useful. And if I have to kind of just figure it out on my own, it could be more difficult. And in fact, altruism is often very ineffective. That's something that I study. So like it is kind of difficult sometimes, or people just don't care other times to like figure out where my efforts are going to be useful. However, where this runs into an issue is, as I said before, he then turns around and proposes things that actually make your worse, actually weaken that signal, actually sort of dilute the signal by which people are paying you because they want you to do something that's actually productive for the economy. So I feel like you can't really have it both ways. But I'm guessing that instinct of his is coming in part from the ideal of an efficient labor market, sending you some kind of really efficient signal about where your labor is going to be useful. And that's sort of this really great like win-win kind of thing if people also want to be productive. Yeah, I think the problem is that, as he rightly identified in another part of the article, there's no law of economics that lines up that real genuine signal with the money that we want people to have. He doesn't put it in those terms, but he almost does, because of course he wants people to support a family and all those kinds of things. And there's just nothing that lines those two things up. And so his solution, because he really loves work, is to kind of like force and do make work and kind of like force the market to fill in that gap. And of course, Alex's solution and our solution often in this group is to fill in that gap with actual cash in a way, right?
To be fair, I don't think Oren would say that you're having an inefficient market. And he probably wouldn't even call it make work. He might say that, we want the market to operate efficiently in the context of certain conditions, and how we set up those conditions determines what an efficient market is going to do. And one of the things he wants a so-called efficient market to do is to provide people with an opportunity to contribute through meaningful paid work. So he's not, you and I would probably say, well, that's an example of a market inefficiency. But if that's your goal, everyone agrees, or I think we all here agree, that we want to orient markets toward desirable social outcomes. So this is what I was getting at the beginning. What are our desirable social outcomes? What, does it make sense for us to desire in terms of outcomes? And if his desires are different, then what he views as an efficient market is going to be different too.
Yeah, but I guess I think my critique still stands, which is that if he's arguing that work for people is important because it's a good signal that you're having a genuine contribution, I do still think that some of his proposals undermine that signal. And so you're right that if you take it as a given that people should have work, then he's arranging the market to do that. But we were trying to investigate kind of like why you would think that's a good thing. And that's where I think he runs into some contradictions.
Yeah, so there's the question about does some of the things he's proposing, kind of weaken the signal of what's important work? And Austin asked the question in the chat too. Would Oren argue that a wage subsidy amplifies the signal telling you what's valuable rather than diluting it? And I think he wouldn't necessarily argue that it amplifies the signal of what's valuable, but he'd probably say that it minimally interferes with it, because you're subsidizing wages across the whole economy, so you still have an even playing field among employers.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that in particular to me seem to, well, I guess that weakens the signal only in the sense that you're paying people to stay employed rather than to be not employed at all. I don't know if that weakens the signal or not. I have to think it through. Maybe Alex can think that through more quickly than I can.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it is a little bit of a dampening of efficient incentives or efficient signals. I think in absolute terms, the signals are still there in terms of businesses aren't going to hire people who, it isn't useful for them to hire. But if you're subsidizing wages across the whole economy, it might signal that more work is, it might signal that there's more of a priority of labor over leisure, and it might signal that work in general is more productive than it actually is if we didn't subsidize wages.
Yeah, so I could imagine that it undermines potentially, say, investment in automation slightly because you're making labor artificially cheap. It might undermine going to cheaper foreign labor, which is something he wants, but again, like that's sort of inefficient. So it does kind of push things in certain directions that are wasting people's time unnecessarily, I would say, in the end.
Yes. And he would say, of course, that it's not wasting people's time if they have the job. So he'd kind of like go in that circle again.
Which we've gone through.
Which we've gone through. We've gone through it enough times.
We've gone through it a few times too.
So Ubu7 in the YouTube live stream is asking, do we have data on people with passive income from inheritance and their employment rates? So that's an interesting question. There's also questions about people with passive income in general. Are they more depressed? That kind of thing. That can maybe to some extent help us tease apart how much of this stuff is baked into our psychology, how much of it is culture, and how much of it is, the fact that individuals happen to be in a situation where they depend on jobs, or in a context where they depend on jobs for their income.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't know the data on that. I wish I did. It's a great question. One thing that I would say is, anecdotally, it's interesting, and I think this has been pointed out here before, that very wealthy people sometimes still work in our culture, whereas in the past, in other cultures and in other times in Western culture, that wasn't always the case as much. That wasn't always the norm to the same degree, or like women were not always expected to work to the same degree, things like that. So the norms can change. And I guess one thing I would say is that one limitation of looking at people who have passive income in our current culture and economy is that they're still within the context of an economy where most people have to work to earn a living. And so they might be highly influenced by that. And they might have internalized a value of work that would change if the entire structure of the economy changed and most people were living off a basic income or something like that. That said, we also talked about in the cultural incentives one that there are other reasons to work besides money in terms of social incentives. So maybe you're showing off a skill or making extra money, which is always good. Or, there are other things that and those might persist as motivations with the basic income as well. And you might see those with people with passive income too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We can't get a clean read on what people's psychology would be in a society where everyone had passive income just by looking at people who have passive income in the context of today's culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So I have a quote that we can go to that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, Bethany.
Great. Let's do it.
Only through production does the ability to consume exist. Production without consumption creates options. Consumption without production creates dependence and debt. Most of the activities and achievements that give life purpose and meaning are, whether in the economic sphere or not, fundamentally acts of production.
Oof. Did you see? Yeah. He's a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying that because I feel like lawyers are supposed to be careful with their language, and yeah.
Well,
but okay,
he's not a practicing lawyer.
I should stop critiquing him because I do think he has a lot of good insights. But I do have a few issues with this. So one thing here is that the sentence about production and consumption seems to apply on a social level, but not necessarily on an individual level, depending on how the economy is set up, which I'm sure is something you were thinking about, Alex, right? So certainly, I guess as an individual, if I produce without consuming, that might create options. It might not. It depends on whether I'm paid for it. Because we live in an economy, as Derek has pointed out, where everything is intermediated by money at this point. So I could produce all sorts of things that other people take from me for no money and have no options. If, let's say, I'm a slave or something like that. We don't have slavery now, but or I'm paid very little or nothing for what I'm doing. I'm forced to do it. And then of course, consumption without production. If you have a basic income, and that's steady and reliable from your government, and the whole society as an aggregate is producing enough, isn't necessarily going to create dependence and debt. So I think it depends on what level you're looking at and how things are structured. And then the second sentence, I think of what Derek pointed out before, which is that, for example, feeding your children and providing good life for them includes a fair degree of consumption, but people find that very meaningful. And that might be one of the reasons that they work, is to do that consumption, but it's still an act of consumption. So, and lots of people find going to a concert really meaningful. Lots of people find all sorts of acts of consumption meaningful. I think that they like to be of value and they like to contribute, but sometimes that simultaneously involves kind of like consumption and giving, like we're talking about with getting something for your children, or getting a gift for your mom, or being able to care for your mom. That requires some money as well as some effort or whatever. So, yeah, I just don't know that anything in this article convinced me of this sentence. I think, as Alex pointed out before, it's supposed to be something we intuitively agree with. And if you don't intuitively agree with it, it starts to break down a little bit.
Yeah, I think when he says production without consumption creates options, maybe what he's alluding to is not just in aggregate in the economy as a whole, but if you're working and you're earning money, you have the option to spend that money. So you're producing more and you're saving up money, and then that gives you flexibility. Whereas consumption without production is maybe you're spending down your savings, you're going into debt, or something along those lines on the individual level.
That's how I read it. Sorry, go ahead, Derek. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, we can also look at it in real resource terms too, without money. And in that sense, I mean, his first sentence makes sense, right? That doesn't make sense to think of consuming something that was never produced. Like, you have to produce goods in order to consume them. So that's true. But then, production is not, that doesn't mean, that's not the same thing as saying work, right? Work is one resource that goes into the productive process. And just like Bethany said, it's very important to differentiate between how productive the economy is versus how productive each and every individual person is. But when he goes to say consumption without production creates dependence and debt, I mean, I think if you're looking at the economy and you're just modeling dependence and debt as problems, in and of themselves, like that's weird, because the economy is all about interdependence, and it is all about debt to a certain extent. I mean, if you accept that money is debt and that we're all operating on promises for future production, then we can't really say that these are problems. So I think he's just modeling it wrong, and he's a little bit afraid of the idea of interdependence and the fact that we all benefit from having been born into an economy that's developed over a period of time and has so many efficiency advantages and different, intellectual advances that have occurred over the years. We all benefit from that. We all benefit from being interdependent, not only with like our friends and coworkers, but with everything in the entire economy. So I think he's just kind of missing the forest for the trees there.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's an excellent point, Derek. And I do think it's interesting now that you say that he really emphasizes dependence as like dependence on government money or government aid, but not necessarily dependence on companies, right? And so, for example, Carl Redequist, I think, points out rightly that like it's not like we have a non-dependent option. Not that we would even want one, as you point out, there are a lot of benefits, but it's not like we have or ever really have had, to be honest. If you study human societies, we've never really had a non-dependent option. We've always been a cultural species that was very interdependent. It could have been that the closest to this would be there are societies where once you've learned the skills, which you never could have come up with on your own, but once you've learned them from your culture, maybe you could go off and like survive on some land by yourself. But we don't even have that kind of independence available to us now, because most of us aren't just given like either the skills nor the supplies or the land or anything else that we would need to like have a living without being dependent on something. So it's really about dependence on companies and the market versus dependence on the government. And it's interesting that he cares so much about which kind of dependence is there and sort of only calls one dependence and not the other, I think is how I would summarize part of what you were pointing out, Derek, and thinks of it as such a problem to be dependent on the government and not at all a problem to be dependent on the companies. And then to add another layer, of course, you're dependent on the government too, because the companies, as he points out, don't naturally create enough work for you. So then the government has to do that, but shouldn't supply it directly. So it's a whole kind of like layering thing. Yeah.
I want to hear what Alex says, but let's footnote that because I wanted to get into his overall view of how we live in a consumer economy and not a worker-oriented economy. And that's highly questionable, I think.
Yeah, good point. Alex, sorry, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I like your point about the kinds of dependence, because in here, when we talk about people being dependent on the market or on private employers, we want to force people to be dependent on private employers, but only to the extent that we want them to do something for the market, for the private employers, right? And then to the extent that we don't need them to do that, they can be dependent on the government. They can be dependent on the basic income. And this first sentence here in this excerpt, only through production does the ability to consume exist. I mean, like Derek was saying, that's true. And it really, it kind of calls to the attention to the fact that production exists to serve consumption. Consumption is the benefit that we receive, and production is kind of a secondary thing that we do to make that happen. So in this paragraph, even while he's trying to emphasize the primacy of production and productive activity, he's admitting that we do it so people can consume. We do it so other people can reap the benefit of that production, of that product.
Yeah, that's right. I was just thinking also that he would maybe say, as a counterpoint to my point, that like, well, if you have something of value to sell, and then like you can do that, you're even if you're dependent on companies, you're still kind of self-reliant in a way that if you're not selling anything to the government, they just value you because you're a person and they give you money, then that's not quite the same thing. And I guess to that critique I've drummed up in my head, I would also point out what Derek said, which is like, it's a little more complicated than that, right? Because like, of course, whether you have something of value to sell, as he also points out in the article, it like depends on all sorts of other conditions that are being set in part by the government, but also like depends on the whole history of the economy and where things stand and all of this. So it just seems like, again, an intuition that feels true to many people, but is actually kind of endogenous to the way that things are set up and the fact that we actually have to sell our labor to survive. And so we have this sense of like, oh, it's great to be like, have something of value to sell and then like be self-reliant. And like, if I don't have anything of value that people are willing to pay me for, then I'm not contributing in the right way or something like that. Yeah. One other side point to that is like this kind of rhetoric is also used to just sell lower different tax policies, right? Because right now we tend to fund or feel that we need to fund payments to people via taxes. And so there are also like people with a particular interest in selling this narrative of quote unquote self-reliance as a way just to pay less money. So there's that kind of like cynical angle of how these ideologies get internalized as well, which is probably worth bringing up.
Derek, did you have a point you wanted to get to?
Well, what I wanted to get to wasn't quite directly related to what Bethany just said, but back to I think one of the things I found the most fascinating about this article was the story it tells about the problem with the economy and the problem with society. And I think many articles like this all have that. They have to tell a story about, okay, we've been going in a certain direction and it's not working out. We got to change paths. And the direction he doesn't like is that we have a consumer-driven economy, and economists are, relentlessly pursuing higher GDP, which he takes to be kind of commensurate with, more to consume or pushing in a more consumptive-oriented direction. But it's really, it's really interesting, right? Like I think it's worth really trying to, from a neutral perspective, whether we think it's a good or bad idea, to really try to understand, okay, well, what direction are we moving in? What is the official stated line about the economy? How is the economy officially designed? And if you go to the Federal Reserve website, I mean, it's almost like they've read Oren's article, because they talk in explicit detail about how they are trying every day, trying harder to make employment more widely distributed and more inclusive as a benefit to society. And that rhetoric is very deep in the official policy rhetoric that very strongly determines how the economy is run. And that's not a recent development. That's sort of been there for quite a while. And they've been going in this direction for a long time. And so it is interesting. I do hear a characterization that we live in a consumer-driven economy, but in whatever sense he means that, right? It can't be in a technical sense. It can't be in a policy sense, because that's not actually what we're doing. We live very explicitly in a full employment private sector economy. So like I think that's important, because for his argument to make sense, it has to be the case that like we've gone too far down the consumer-oriented path, and we have to avert paths now before it's too late. And it looks a little different once you understand, well, actually, a lot of smart people are trying as hard as possible to achieve the outcome that he's suggesting. And I mean, that might suggest that, well, maybe there's something off with the objective once you notice that.
Yeah, I think to some extent, in terms of classical liberalism and classical economics, like with Adam Smith and David Ricardo and that kind of stuff, they do talk about the workers, but they also do have this kind of consumer-oriented perspective, especially when it comes to trade. That if you have, free trade, then there's that opens up people to work on their comparative advantage, and everyone wins and that kind of thing. So that's kind of like the classical liberal and neoliberal perspective, and that is very common in especially academic economics. In terms of macroeconomic policy, macroeconomics kind of started with John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, and he was trying to solve the problem of involuntary unemployment. So that was the birth of macroeconomics. So it was baked in right from the beginning that we were trying to ensure that people had good enough jobs, that kind of thing. So most of the arguing in that policy space is about, well, what's the best way to ensure that people are working productively, and the economy is humming along, with the labor market being what contributes the economy's product, but also what provides consumers with their income, that kind of thing. So you're right, it's kind of all kind of entangled, and it can be useful to disentangle that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd like to read a few more points from the chat too, because I think there are some good ones.
Yeah, actually, I want to quickly get to so Diane Pagan is on the YouTube live chat.
Oh, great.
And she's saying, "Hey all, I doubt the knowledge base of Cass and why anyone would think he has a legitimate base on which to craft responsible anti-poverty policy. Does he have any firsthand experience of poverty?" So actually, it's a funny story. I was down in New York back in 2019, and I happened to be reading Oren Cass's book at the time, The Once and Future Worker, when I saw Diane Pagan, and she's like, "Oh, what are you reading?" So she went and read the book and got really angry and wrote a whole article refuting Oren Cass and The Once and Future Worker. So I encourage you guys to go check that out as well. But the idea that, he doesn't have any personal experience, so I think it's useful to kind of draw on people's personal experience, because sometimes you might get insights that you wouldn't otherwise get. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to people who don't have that experience, or who are still thinking about the various issues and various factors. Like we can, I would prefer to critique Oren's arguments on what he's saying, rather than what's behind why he's saying what he's saying, or like something to do with him and his life experience, or something like that.
Yeah. That said, there are a few quotes in there, Diane, if you're listening, where I specifically wrote a note to myself that you would have a field day with this point, because there were things that were kind of suggesting that like the social safety net is just so amazing in the US that somehow like people are disincentivized from working, and like it was pretty ridiculous. So I understand where you're coming from.
Well, I mean, the social safety net does have these problems, like with welfare cliffs and stuff like that. So I think Oren and Diane would agree that it's not working ideally in terms of what its objective is.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Should we read a few things from the chat before we run out of time?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Richard points out that there are policies that promote zombie companies and reduce the incentive to automate. And I think that's absolutely right. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the proposals that Oren seems to suggest, is that maybe it wouldn't be like, I don't know how extreme he wants to go, but it does seem like he wants to promote incentives towards work away from what might be more efficient, like automation.
If there's a company that can stay in business because maybe their product is really labor intensive and wouldn't otherwise exist, but labor is cheaper because of the wage subsidy, then maybe you could call that a zombie company.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Derek,
well, in the chat also, like Austin mentioned that if we're consuming more than we produce, there would be high inflation and little waste, but we have low inflation and lots of waste. And I just think like there was something there relating to Oren's earlier point about consumption and production, like consuming coming from producing. And I just think it's great if we can develop a sense where these things are harmoniously arranged, and like it's not possible for us to consume more than we produce, really. Then you start to get this inflation problem. And so like recognizing that, I think maybe can help bring those perspectives together. And I like to frame consumer spending as the way that we learn what work is most productive. That's how we determine what work is most productive, is figuring out what do people actually want.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise we'll just be creating stuff, endlessly.
Yeah. At the aggregate level, it's not possible for the economy to consume more than it produces unless it's drawing down inventories of stuff we produced in the past that we didn't consume. So I think Oren is more talking about the individual level when he says that.
Yeah, but I think that's a great perspective and a great point, because presumably if it's possible even to give people money, which he doesn't really deny, and allow them to consume without working, then clearly we don't really need everybody's labor, at least for the current level of production. And so how do we know that we need it for optimal production? And so again, Oren isn't interested in that. He thinks of work as its own benefit in and of itself. But it does point to this idea that maybe we don't need everybody's labor, and there are real costs. Like he even points out some of them, like he wants the air quality potentially to be worse as an incentive to get people working in lower quality, in lower paid, lower skill kinds of jobs in the
or
United
he's
States.
willing to pay that cost at least.
Sorry, I shouldn't say he wants it to be. No, of course not. Yeah, sorry, but he thinks that those kinds of trade-offs are necessary, and those kind of trade-offs are worth making, just to have people be working instead of, for example, getting a basic income. So. Yeah.
So I want to get to one final quote from the article before we get to final thoughts from Bethany and Derek. Claims that overall growth is robust and wages not so bad don't remedy ongoing social collapse, reverse workforce abandonment, or lessen government dependence. They only underscore the disconnect between conventional economic measures and the quality of life for which those measures are supposed to provide proxies. So social collapse is obviously bad, but what's the problem with workforce abandonment and government dependence? Why do we think of these things as bad things? So I think we kind of got into this a little bit, but really, how do we get around this psychology of thinking of these as bad?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that it's a little bit chicken and egg, because as I point out, sometimes you need the conditions to change for the psychology to change, but then maybe it's hard to get the conditions to change if you can't convince people that these things aren't good enough in of themselves, things like paid employment. So I think that is a little bit tricky. Yeah. I don't know, Derek, did you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, mostly I agree with that. It's hard to figure that out. And I would just say, I think we should approach it from both fronts. So there's the economic efficiency argument, which interestingly, he seems to be on board with, actually. He actually sort of seems to concede that, like, well, actually, it'd be simpler and more efficient to just do everything for the benefit of consumers, but we're going to pay some cost in that to maximize worker benefit. And so I guess, or working benefit. So I guess, what it makes me wonder more about is the process by which people come to arrive at their priority of goals, their hierarchy of values. How do people think about that, right? I mean, is he just taking this for given, or did he go through a careful process and think like, well, okay, should we put the worker first, the consumer first? How should we do it? And I mean, that's sort of what it makes me think about, because the way he phrases it here, if you're accepting it as a good in and of itself, you can't really argue with that. But what you could maybe do is ask more about how people are figuring out what the priority is for, or what people really want. That's something that makes me think about.
Yeah, so this is a good discussion, you guys. I think part of what Oren Cass does illustrate nicely is that if you are trying to ensure that the majority of people have access to a decent job, and Derek pointed this out before, economic policy starts to become very complicated. So Oren offers some compelling ideas for how to simplify pro-work and pro-worker policies, but if the working hypothesis is wrong, then it's a lot of wasted effort. So next Tuesday, we have returning guest Michael Lewis coming on, along with Steve Nunez of the Jane Family Institute, to talk about the welfare system and their recent paper co-authored with Sidhya Balakrishnan entitled Reweaving the Social Safety Net. So that should be a lot of fun. And remember, it's going to be on Tuesday. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Bethany.
Yeah, I did have a closing that I forgot to put in my intro, but it's not that